The year is 1996. The day is December 20th. And come midnight, horror films are never going to be the same. Why? Let me ask you a better question.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Welcome to Why Do We Like? A closer look at the content that captivates us. I'm Grant Lease, your host and technically professional content aficionado. By day, I'm the director of development at Bill Burr's All Things Comedy, which is a Hollywood production company, and my job there is to dissect comedic projects at every stage, pinpoint what makes them tick, and see how we can elevate them. On this channel, I widen my analytical lens and take a look at the films, music, and games that I love, all in a quest to uncover the secret ingredients that make them, or anything, so compelling.
Your secret stuff.
If you enjoy what you see and hear in this episode, do me a favor and hit subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment. As a new channel, I really want to get your feedback on what works and what doesn't. With any luck, your direction can help me turn this, which is my passion project, into something as enjoyable and rewarding for you to consume as it is for me to create. And no matter what, thanks for watching. To crack this channel's first filmic nut, I've created the patented Why Do We Like collection of criteria, Criterion Collection Categorical Roadmap. Over the next however many minutes, we'll break Scream down into parts, put each one under the microscope to start to understand how it works, and how it ends up being more than the sum of those parts when we jam them all back together. The order that I'm putting this in is roughly established to mirror a viewer's journey when watching the film. So that order is storytelling mechanics, which I break down into concept, structure, and dialogue, cast and performances, direction, music, themes, in Scream's case, the horror and the humor, and lastly, rewatchability. In toto, we should have a pretty good understanding of the ingredients that Scream puts into its pressure cooker to make a delicious, memorable, haha horrific slasher stew, and a very long-winded answer to the title question of the episode. Why do we like Scream?
I love this one. It's a Scream, baby. Hold on a sec. I'll be right back.
But where do we begin? How do we get here in the first place? What was it that made Scream, a humble $14 million film released back in 1996, stand out above its fellow slashers and evolve into the jugular slashing juggernaut that it is today? It started with a phone call.
Hello?
Not that phone call. Not yet, at least. The phone call that sprung Scream into existence was one between the screenwriter, Kevin Williamson, and one of his close friends. This was the early 90s, and Williamson had just heard about the Gainesville Ripper, a real-life serial killer who murdered 5 students over 4 days in the early 90s. And after learning about this, Williamson was a bit on edge. He was living at home, alone, and one evening he found an open window in his house, which spooked him. He grabbed a nearby knife and called one of his good friends for solace. Given the spirit of the moment, the two quickly started discussing horror movies and the iconic killers who populated them. And with that, the seed of Scream already began to take root. What Williamson did was meld the idea of the Gainesville Ripper with his frustrations with the stale formula of contemporary slasher films. So he took what I can only assume was a typewriter and began to wail away. It took only 3 days for him to finish the first draft of the screenplay, along with 2 5-page treatments for sequels. Now, if none of you have ever had the displeasure of screenwriting, I have, please know how absolutely insane that is. It's like giving birth to a fully born child after like 6 weeks. In fact, 6 weeks is the bare minimum that professional screenwriters under contract get to write a script. Unions had to negotiate that. And at that point, there's already typically been underlying material, there's treatments, there's outlines, there's approved content that they're working off of. To take an idea from concept to screenplay in only 3 days is the sort of thing that only happens in myth, like Athena springing fully formed from the head of Zeus. But every now and again, a piece of popular art does have just such a provenance. And when looking back, it's hard to see it as anything other than divine inspiration or a sign of the success to come. But those are all just background, the facts that matter. What about the actual concept? You would imagine, since we're here, that I'm pretty bullish on the ideas behind Scream. And you would be correct. Scream is one of my favorite films of all time, which is no small part of why I'm choosing to launch my channel with its analysis. And Scream's concept is incredible. First of all, it's high concept. In Hollywood speak, high concept just means that a film can be understood in a sentence. Snakes on a Plane, for example, that's about as high concept as they come. All you need is the title. And as you can tell from that example, high concept does not mean high art, at least not necessarily. Oftentimes these films are more concerned about pulling off the promise of their premise that they leave other more important elements of the film on a back burner, like character or character arcs, the stuff that really sticks on your bones after the cotton candy of the high concept is dissolved. Scream is a high concept film that transcends this. Though being a notoriously hard film to categorize, its actual concept is rather simple. It's a horror movie where the characters and the killer know all the tropes of horror movies.
You should never say who's there. Don't you watch scary movies? It's a death wish.
But simplicity of concept by no means guarantees quality of execution. In fact, that's a common pitfall with these sorts of high concept films. They promise something that they don't deliver. To speak to the business side of Hollywood again, the beauty of a high concept idea is that it doesn't experience much friction in the selling apparatus. Allow me a brief digression on some Hollywood bullshit. What I mean by that is, to get any film sold, no matter what stage it's at, there's always a series of pitches and meetings. You will rarely be bringing your idea to the most important person at the company, the one who greenlights your idea. If you are, thanks for watching this channel. We should grab lunch sometime. But for the rest of you, you're not going to be pitching someone who's that high up. You pitch a sort of lower down exec. And what they do, if they like your idea, is they pitch it to their boss. And if that boss likes it, they pitch it to their boss, and sort of all the way up the food chain. What happens is you have all these points of failure in this game of telephone for this idea that you care so much about, that you've worked on for years of your life, to completely fall apart, for something to be misinterpreted, misconstrued, mishandled. And that's assuming all of these people are even listening or pitching it to their boss in good faith. Which does not always happen in Hollywood, but that's a separate conversation. The point is, with a high concept film like this, there's a high likelihood that the fidelity of your idea will remain intact as you pitch it up the food chain. So, at least in selling terms, high concept equals higher odds of success. Of course, that's just the selling. If all goes well, you still have to write the damn thing. And that's the hard part. Ideas are cheap. Everyone has them. Turning them into functional products, that's the hard part. That's writing. And that's why screenwriters are paid the big bucks. Working in development, I've seen more projects than you could count get sold as a pitch, because that pitch is a cool idea. It's like RoboCop, but it's a Western on the moon. It's only once the actual writing and development begins that you realize, oh, this person actually had no idea how to actually make this happen, how to actually do this. They just thought it sounded cool. And maybe they were right, but I'm getting ahead of myself with all this. This is what we're going to talk about next. For this section, for the concept alone, 10 out of 10 plane snakes for screen. Thankfully, Kevin Williamson, even early in his screenwriting career, did know how to execute this idea. That's kind of the whole reason we're here. But my goal in this video essay is not just to tell you that he crushed it. If you've seen the film and loved it, perhaps you're here to see someone else gush about something you loved. Always a great experience, a big part of why I come to YouTube. Or maybe you want to see other elements of the film that you missed or wanted to hear discussed at greater length. And if you didn't like the film, frankly, it is surprising that you made it this far. But hopefully my discussion of what is to come will at least help enlighten you as to why some people do respond to it so much. First, the screenwriting maxim. Structure is storytelling. For me, when I first encountered this idea as a budding screenwriter myself, I wasn't exactly sure what to make of it. But the more I labored, the more clear the idea became. In fact, it's kind of a tautology, an idea that defines itself. Of course, structure is storytelling. Storytelling is ultimately just the art of putting facts and events in their most entertaining and effective order, in their most entertaining and effective structure. At its basis, you can't tell a punchline before the joke, as it were. There's rules. And storytelling for the screen comes with its own set of rules. You may have heard of Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, Rules for Screenwriting, which is a formula that pretty much all of us screenwriters have tried out at some point or another. Some love it, some hate it, but what it does very effectively is capture the general idea of how to arc out and build a story for fast-moving, long-form screen projects. Many deride it as too formulaic. Those criticisms aren't without merit. It can feel deflating to think that artistic endeavors can be so rule-driven, so sort of expected as to be almost algorithmic. But the biggest rule is thus. You can break every rule in the book if your script is good enough. This naturally occasions a follow-up question. How do I know if my script is good enough? What am I being judged by? Is it the rules? How can I use the rules to know when to break the rules? Feed all this to a robot and you'll fry its brain like you're asking it to tell you how to love. But that's the way it goes. Film's a subjective medium. It's a populist one, and the answer kind of boils down to, if enough people think it's good. Rules be damned. Part of what made Scream stand out was its gleeful willingness to break those rules. Rule number 1, establish your hero immediately and make us like them. If you've seen Scream, you can already tell that this one got gutted faster than a high school jock on a pool deck. One of Scream's greatest subversive moves, and I don't know if I really need to put a spoiler warning at this point, given the purpose of this essay, but at the very least here it is. Spoilers, is that the biggest star of the movie, the first name on the poster, the woman front and center on the artwork, gets killed in the first scene. And not just any first scene either. The opening sequence of Scream is one of the greatest opening sequences of all time. As far as horror films go, the only other one that even holds a candle to it is the opening of the original Halloween, with the absolutely slick reveal after a grisly POV murder that the person we were watching, the point of view we were looking at this from, was not some adult killer, it was a 6-year-old Michael Myers. Also, in honorable mention for Inglourious Bastards, whose entire Once Upon a Time in Nazi-occupied France sequence is absolutely goated.
You're sheltering enemies of the state, are you not?
As long as we set our sights on the first sequence, we might as well dig deep, because such intense study is really rewarding. And I'll try not to belabor this section too much, it's fairly long. I actually already wrote and rejected a version of this script that was pretty much video length in its own right, but what I do want to do is narrow in on how perfectly structured and executed this scene is.
Hello?
To start, over black, the phone rings. It's a shrill jolt of audio to get us in. It's simple, it's effective, it's hooky, and it's going to become a series landmark. Almost every Scream starts with a call.
What's your favorite scary movie?
The immediate discussion of horror movies. Scream is already delivering on its metatextual high-concept premise. This is a movie in which the characters and killers know about horror movies. If you're an audience member watching this, you've already raised an eyebrow. This isn't how these movies are supposed to go. If they know the tropes, how are they gonna act? It's what gets us excited and what immediately creates this sense of tension. I love this. What movie is complete without popcorn? And thus, what movie-literate movie like Scream is complete without its characters eating popcorn while they discuss movies? It's a great little touch that shows us how fully the script will embody its concept. It also serves incredible double duty as a ticking clock and another source of tension. As Casey's situation grows more dire, the Jiffy Pop is abandoned, ballooning on the stove, promising a bang when it pops.
Listen, asshole!
And filling the air with smoke and even flame as she ignores it. It's beautiful. And then the first most important moment. This is the sinister turn.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
What did you say?
I want to know who I'm talking to.
That's not what you said.
Just one line, one terrifying line, shifts the mood. In improv, this would be called the first unusual thing, an unexpected turn that establishes the true nature of the scene we're in. In this case, it's more of a first terrifying thing. Casey isn't being flirted with, she's being watched, she's hunted. Like one of the poor girls in one of these horror movies she just mentioned. As soon as this happens, a dissonant piano note rings. Dogs begin to bark outside.
What did you say?
I want to know who I'm talking to.
That's not what you said.
And what? An intruder? The atmosphere builds, the stress mounts, the tension rises even further. But speaking again to structure, establishing trust in a screenplay's voice and execution is absolutely vital in the first moments. People put things down very, very quickly. Williamson here shows an incredible amount of chops, penning an extremely discomforting line for Casey that also, sort of paradoxically, comforts the audience. Our movie-going experience is going to be in good hands. Things only escalate from here. The unknown caller, whose voice has gone from sultry to sulphurous, promises to kill Barrymore if her character hangs up one more time.
No, you listen, Doodle. You hang up on me again, I'll gut you like a fish, understand?
The threat has heightened from implicit to explicit. Excellent. The killer, who we'll soon know as the iconic figure of Ghostface, calls Casey Blondie. The threat escalates again. We've gone from the threat of being watched, a potential untruth, maybe she's just being fucked with, to verification. Whoever's on the phone is in the same environment as Casey. They know she's blonde, and thus the threats of violence gain real-life credence. Then, perhaps, the most crucial moment of the whole scene, at least in terms of telling us what sort of movie we're in.
You should never say who's there. Don't you watch scary movies? It's a death wish. You might as well just come out here to investigate a strange noise or something.
Beautiful. If the opening conversation about movies was Babe Ruth pointing to center field, this moment is him cranking it out of the park. Here's the film's thesis on display. These people don't just know about horror movies as a concept, they're horror movie literate. They know these annoying and unbelievable tropes, and because of it, they'll act accordingly. They'll be better than that. As an audience member, this means your roadmap of what to expect has gone out the door. And if you don't know what to expect, anything can happen. And that's exactly what our great movies, like Scream, promise to deliver. Continuing on, the tension is already so high, the threat of violence even realer. Where do we go from here? Scream brings the threat even closer to Barrymore's character as Ghostface reveals he has her boyfriend, Steve, tied up just outside, his fate in her hands. He he forces her to play a game, one that, in the same vein as the film itself, rewards the knowledge of horror movies. What I love about this, what's so elegant about this from a writing side, is the juxtaposition of fear and play. Movies like Saw have since turned the idea of playing a game amidst one's terror into a meme, but the reason that it's popular is because it works. Play as a concept is almost the exact opposite of fear. We cannot truly be playing in the presence of fear. In fact, we often use play to help conquer fear. Play acting the things we find scary, like war or romance, in a sort of instinctive exposure therapy. It lets us go through the motions safely without any of the stakes. In fact, what is a horror movie but a similar reenactment? A purposefully curated recreation of the real-life stakes of life and death that could be lurking around any corner. Perhaps a knife-wielding serial killer is an unlikely way to go, but it certainly is a concrete way to cement those fears. As humans, we're the only creatures aware of our unavoidable demise. We're also the only creatures to turn that fear into a many billion-dollar industry. Not that we're aware of any of this in the moment as Casey Becker is going through her ordeal, but somewhere, to some degree, truths of that nature swirl, and it's part of what makes this moment so terrifying and so compelling. Casey does her best, but poor Steve becomes the film's first victim after she fails Ghostface tests.
I'm sorry. That's the wrong answer.
The real killer in Friday the 13th is not Jason Voorhees, he came later. His mother is the killer in the first one, extracting vengeance for the counselor's negligence that led to her son's death. Also a fun moment to pause on here, Scream was constantly battling against the MPAA to avoid an NC-17 rating, one that would essentially tank its mass appeal, ruin its commercial chances, and one of their concessions they made was cutting the extent of Steve's wiggling guts after he's eviscerated.
Approved!
Nice. Next question from Ghostface.
What door am I at?
The game continues, the threat getting realer. Next, a glimpse of the killer as he flits between rooms. I remember being so creeped out by this the first time that I saw it. Finally, the reveal. A whip turn by the killer to give us our first glimpse of the iconic Ghostface mask. I absolutely love this mask, its inherent creepiness. I believe it's no small part of why Scream remains so sticky in the cultural consciousness. More on the mask later, there's some fun details about it. For now, please note that it was based on a design called the Peanut-Eyed Ghost, and good luck ever unseeing that. Now, finally, after 10 minutes, Ghostface is upon Casey. How'll she ever get out of this? She's our star. She's Drew Barrymore, the original Nepo baby. Surely she'll make it through this, right? Scream put its most subversive moment at the very beginning, annihilating the star in a grisly fashion. She's within inches of her parents, of salvation, but her throat is cut, her voice no more than a hoarse whisper. The phone is still in her hand, her parents can hear her when they pick up the other line.
Oh my god, I can hear her! Where is she?
The danger is obvious, but their baby's nowhere to be found. And quite notably, this sequence doesn't just end after the killing blow. Most films would. What happens next is the final promise of this incredible opening. There will be consequences. We don't just see a kill, get our fix, and then move on. We linger, watching the Beckers' heartbreak as they see their daughter gutted, strung up in a tree. That's not what happens in these sorts of movies, and that's because Scream isn't that sort of movie. Scream doesn't happen in horror movie world. Scream happens in the real world, a world with consequences, a world where horror movies exist and characters have seen them, remember? That was the promise. And unlike the horror movie world, the real world doesn't have rules. We end this incredible sequence in the only way we ever really could have, with a final blood-curdling scream.
I know. That's why we need proof. If I'm right about this, I could save a man's life. Do you know what that could do for my book sales?
My goodness, we're still talking about the writing? Well, how about we talk about the writing of the talking? The dialogue in Scream absolutely sings. The teens rock a slang-heavy patois that has aged incredibly well and also serves as a great time capsule for how 90s kids talked while still feeling deeply authentic. When I do dabble in screenwriting these days, I'm often what's referred to as a dialogue guy, which really just means that I like the good words and I want my characters to use them goodly. And it's a big part of why I like Scream. Scream's sharp dialogue not only helps it stand out in my mind, but it helps it stand out amidst its much more lazily scripted horror cohorts. At least at the time, but honestly still to this day in a lot of ways. Some of my favorite moments include...
It's the millennium. Motives are incidental.
Let me breasts. I want to see Jamie Lee's breasts. When do we see Jamie Lee's breasts?
Breasts? Not until Trading Places in '83. Jamie Lee was always the virgin in horror movies. She never showed her tits till she went legits.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
If I'm right about this, I could save a man's life. Do you know what that could do for my book sales?
Is that you, Randy? And what movie is this from? I spit on your garage.
Fucking hit me with the phone, Dick!
You look awfully young to be a police officer.
I'm 25 years old.
You know, in a demographic study, I proved to be most popular amongst males 11 to 24. So you do watch the show?
I'm 25. I was 24 for a whole year. There's always some stupid bullshit reason to kill your girlfriend. Number one, you can never have sex. No! Big no-no! Do you know what that constellation is?
No, what is it?
I don't know, that's why I was asking you.
My mom and dad are gonna be...
For horror movies alone, I think Scream earns a solid 11 out of 10 for the dialogue. But up against the wider field of films at large, I'm landing it at a very respectable and realistic 9 out of 10. Perhaps only dragged down from a 10 by me not wanting to completely shatter any notion of objectivity in my analysis. Dialogue, 9 out of 10 Aaron Sorkins. Overall, the Scream that we know and love works because its many pieces add up to more than the sum of their parts, but those parts all began on the page. The excellent writing has primacy when it comes to explaining Scream's excellence, and it's the first key factor in understanding why we like Scream as much as we do.
Oh, yeah, they asked me that.
Hey, they asked if you like to hunt?
Yeah, they did. They asked you?
Hunt? Why would they ask you if you like to hunt?
Because their bodies were gutted.
Drew Barrymore was initially offered the role of Sidney Prescott, but actually turned it down in favor of Casey Becker, which she said she sparked to even more. Reese Witherspoon and Molly Ringwald were other early candidates for the role, but they were rejected for looking too old and too young, respectively. Neve Campbell, of course, ultimately landed the role, and as with many iconic characters, it's hard to have imagined things ever shaking out any differently. Neve brought a level of quiet strength and intensity to the role that I think was absolutely required of Sidney Prescott. And Sid is now in the pantheon of horror's final girls, those survivors that so often sublimate the boyish traits that lead to their survival, and she is very simply a badass. Despite her relative stoicism, Sid is the emotional centerpiece of the film, and Neve Campbell absolutely nails it. To land the role of Gale Weathers, Courtney Cox actually had to write Wes Craven a letter to convince him that she would have no problem nailing the bitchiness that the part required. My God, what I would give to see that letter. In the film, that bitchiness is borne out perfectly, with Sid's cold cocking of the smug Gale feeling fully justified and fist-pumpingly amazing. Already in her friend's heyday, Cox's appearance helped bring cachet to the project. And though she really never goes above and beyond in notable ways, she hits all of the notes the role requires. After a general audition for a male role, David Arquette eventually landed the role of Dewey. Now, the role itself was first written as more of a dumb jock, but Arquette's portrayal of a sweetie who just wants to be the tough guy elevated him above the field, and lends a unique angle to a character that honestly could have fallen pretty flat otherwise. I've often vacillated between love and hate with Dewey, given his general, punchability, but as time goes on, the more I like him. He brings pathos and kindness to a role that would otherwise be pretty forgettable, and it's that groundwork that allows his character to evolve so charmingly in future films. But for this film, he's a small presence without too much of a lasting effect, but the smiles he brings when on screen are not to be lost. Even if Arquette himself doesn't have the deepest acting chops, he's really found what to do with this role. For her part, Rose McGowan nearly lost the role of Tatum after her agent countered production's initial offer with a salary 5 times its size, from a $50K offer to a whopping $250K counter, the most of the cast by far. Now, despite this debacle, McGowan did land the part, but not until after she was forced to audition a second time. For me, Rose as Tatum is a weak point of the cast, never actively driving things down, but proving the most forgettable of an otherwise memorable bunch. Honestly, even though she has a creative death, I pretty much forget about her existence when I remember this film. I often wonder how my opinion would have changed if one of the other choices for the role, Natasha Lyonne, had landed the gig. Now, having said all that, on a recent rewatch with this very feedback in mind, I paid particular attention to Tatum and found myself pleasantly surprised. The role of Tatum really just props up Sidney, leaving McGowan not to do too much but chew the lines she has. But chew it she does, and she really nails these moments with far more vivacity than I had remembered. Lastly, our killers, Billy and Stu. the homoerotic dynamic duo.
Surprise, Sydney.
Vince Vaughn was actually the original choice for Billy, but he was unable to audition at the time due to health reasons, as ominously vague as that is. Skeet ended up landing the role himself, Skeet Ulrich, after his girlfriend made such a strong pitch to the casting director that the casting director went to see Skeet instead of the other way around.
Strike that. Reverse it.
And then Matthew Lillard, my favorite of the cast, got Stu after initially trying out for Billy, but casting found him not to be the right person to, quote, make out with Campbell, end quote. Honestly, I fucking love this duo. Skeet is just so skeety, so hateable in the role as Billy, that I really have to catch myself from thinking that he just sucks in real life. And frankly, maybe he does. I'm not too familiar with his work or life outside of this film, but to play this smooth-skinned madman, it'd be hard to imagine doing better. When he finally does go mask off at the end, both literally and figuratively, I believe every deranged word. Same goes for Stu, but with a different flavor. Matthew Lillard gives what is easily my favorite performance in the film.
Hello?
Bringing this lanky charisma to every scene, and honestly finding new depths of batshit when he reveals his role in the murders. Stu, as a character, really had no reason to be involved here other than simply having a screw loose, and Lillard just simply sells that. His incredible ad-libs like, "My mom's gonna be so mad at me," even end up being film highlights. For casting and performances, Billy and Stu, 10 out of 10. Neve Campbell, 10 out of 10. Courtney and Dewey, 7 out of 10. Tatum, 6.5 out of 10. But there's one more key character we haven't discussed, Ghostface. Though more of a cipher than a character, one of the often overlooked elements of the Ghostface character is his physicality. Most specifically, how often and willingly the actor behind the mask got the absolute piss beat out of him in a pretty un-horror-like way. Unlike most of these horror monsters, Ghostface gets punched, kicked, slapped, pushed downstairs, and generally made a fool of. At times it's almost slapstick. It's another one of the horror rules that gets broken. Rule 3, don't beat the shit out of your scary killer. And it's all the better for being broken. By being able to be punched, Ghostface is all the more real, a danger from that real world, which means that when he does turn threatening, those threats are all the realer for it. Ghostface, 9 out of 10. At the helm of the Scream franchise, all the way through the 4th entry in 2011, was the master of horror himself, Wes Craven. But Craven hadn't always been gung-ho for the project. It took the commercial failure in the 90s of one of his latest horror ventures, combined with, quote, an offer he couldn't refuse that actually goaded him into agreeing and to hopping into the director's chair. Craven was initially concerned about his lack of experience directing a satirical film like Scream, but unlike almost every other director the studio had looked at, Craven came to the feature as a horror slasher first. Pretty much all of these other directors, even really high-level names, took it to be a comedic film with some slasher moments. And it was that, in great part, that was one of Scream's strengths. Even if you strip away all of its incredible commentary and humor, it's still a rock-solid slasher with a filmic approach that fits its content. Now, as a viewer, you can never be certain which creative decisions were made purely by the director, but as the last word on what makes it into the frame, no matter the decision, Craven can at least be considered to have tacitly assented to it, if not outright advocated for its inclusion. Given how well this entire piece works, we can rightly credit Craven for his efforts. Here are just a few moments where the direction stood out, at least for me. Acoustic Don't Fear the Reaper needle drop in the makeout scene. Starting the scene immediately after the character's reveal of Casey's death with her empty chair. Some really fun staging, particularly at the fountain scene when we first meet all of the friends, as well as the couch scene in the party at the end. Just a beautiful look that really feels cinematic. One touch I loved is getting even more close-up on Sid's face every separate time that Ghostface calls. It starts out close-up, then gets extreme.
If you hang up on me, you'll die just like your mother.
Hello?
Hello, Sydney.
No!
Just tons of fun canted angles throughout. Killer's boots entering frame in the bathroom, I've always loved that. And more generally, just incredible atmosphere and tension building, especially in the scenes when characters are home alone and about to be attacked. Craven is really firing on all cylinders in these moments. Another moment I love is the reflection of the scream mask in dead Hembry's eyeball. And Tatum's death scene is just incredibly well done. There's something I love about this reverse angle through the fridge that keeps the door in frame. Every time I watch it, I expect to see Ghostface here, and I can really feel Craven's management of our expectations in that moment. He's very good with doors and doorways and having an idea, combined with music, of when we're expecting someone to be there. The on-screen film, Here Halloween, providing diegetic screams and spooky background. The incredible imagery of the bloody windshield wipers on Gail's van, and pretty much everything about the moment when Stu and Randy each try to convince Sid that they aren't the killer. The performances, the camera moves, even the dialogue here, I think is just incredible.
Shoot Mike! You did it! No, I didn't! Please give me that gun! Give me that gun, guys, man! No, I didn't! No, I didn't, Sid! He did it! He did it, Sid did!
But Craven's success was not always assured. The early days of production did not instill this level of confidence in the producers. Notorious troglodyte sex pest Harvey Weinstein and his brother Bob actually considered firing Craven after seeing some of the first dailies, which are the shots of any given day in film processed the next day. Back when we had actual film, this would take a full day for producers and studio members to review. So they saw the work and criticized it as workmanlike at best. Craven managed to keep the gig, clearly, but only after undergoing a gauntlet the likes of which I really hadn't heard of when it comes to the director's chair. First, the Weinsteins wanted the opening scene reshot with a different mask, one they liked better. After some pushback, they agreed to seeing an edit of the existing footage with the existing mask just to prove that the scene worked. But if it didn't work, the project would be canceled, full stop. After what I can only assume was an extremely nerve-wracking editing session, the Weinsteins screened the footage in a screening that barred Craven and even the other producers from seeing it. After the screening, with the entire crew on edge, Bob told Craven and co, "What do I know about dailies? Keep going," and provided additional financing as well as licensing the mask design to prove that producers really do suck and never ever apologize. Honestly, I can't imagine how frustrating that was from the side of Craven and co. It's some of the most Hollywood bullshit I've ever come across. But it really does lend credence to the idea that the best way to say fuck off is with incredible talent, and that there really are no rules so long as you can make a great piece of art. Direction, 8 out of 10 Cravens.
You'll see him in your head on the TV screen. Hey buddy, I'm warning you to turn it on.
One thing that's been really fun about assembling this video essay is that it's forced me to engage with parts of Scream that I hadn't really critically looked at before, or in this case, listen. Now, I'm a musician myself, and music is very important to me. I take pride in my ear, and I love trying to suss out things like character themes and leitmotifs, and all the other cinematic scoring tricks as I take in a film. But when first thinking about this section, I realized I had no idea what the music of Scream sounded like. At least not off the top of my head. So, one of my rewatches, I went back and was surprised at what I found. Scream does not have the most traditional of scores. There's not a hummable melody throughout the entire thing. But what Marco Beltrami's score does provide is incredible soundscaping from beginning to end. It's much more of an ambient soundtrack, one of the many dials that Craven plays with when building up tension and bearing out the scarier moments. I love the moment early on at Sydney's house, when Sid opens a door, obscuring much of the frame, and the music immediately starts to swell, priming us as the audience to expect someone there when she shuts the door. Shut it she does, and there's nothing but hallway. But the music did its job, it built our anticipation. This moment also has a great payoff at Hembry's death sequence when there really is someone behind the door, but now we've been primed to expect misdirection, or at the very least, to not know what to expect. As far as needle drops do go, I've already mentioned the delightful use of the acoustic version of Don't Fear the Reaper, so the only big standout moment for me beyond that is the song that plays in the town shutting down sequence, which is after a curfew is called and school is canceled. That song, which I had to look up, is called Red Right Hand by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. I'd never heard it before outside of the Scream universe, but I can't imagine a track that could capture Scream's tricky tone better. It's just this simple, pitch-perfect assemblage of like ominous whimsy, which is enough to make you feel like there really is something wrong in Woodsboro, but that we're gonna have a really good time figuring out what it is. With its effective but not too memorable scoring, the music of Scream is certainly a part of why we like it, but its background role leaves something to be desired. A title track, a la Carpenter's iconic Halloween thing, is one of the few things I can think that would have truly added to this incredible film. Music, 6.5 Don't Stop Believins out of 10.
Do you like scary movies, Sydney?
I like that thing you're doing with your voice, Randy. It's sexy.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Oh, come on, you know I don't watch that shit.
Why not? Too scared?
No, it's just what's the point? They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
One of the reasons Scream is so fun to take a critical look at is that it has criticism built into the text. The beauty and delight of Scream's running meta-commentary on the horror genre isn't just that Leo meme of calling out things we recognize. As far as commentary goes, that see version is the cheapest form. It doesn't have something to say, it just points out the what of its subject without the more meaningful look at why or how. That's often the danger of meta-commentary, in fact. I know I fell into that trap a lot in my early screenwriting days. There's a delight in having the tropes of the media we consume call out in a self-aware way, especially in a day and age where our society is more inherently media literate than ever. But it's a cheap thrill, and without having the effective use of storytelling mechanisms around those meta moments, or simply an effective story in its own right, it can ring hollow. But that's what Scream does so well. It calls out the tropes while using them, subverting them, working them into the actual narrative instead of more extra-narrative, audience-tailored winks. Scream calls out the tropes of a genre for a reason, to ask it to be better. And what it does so deliciously is package that call to action in an eminently enjoyable slasher flick, giving us its medicine with a spoonful of high fructose corn syrup, colored red, just the way Billy likes it.
Corn syrup. Same stuff they use for pig's blood in Carrie.
A quick note before beginning here, as is typical of thematic analysis, we're about to enter pretty subjective territory. I try to ground as much of my reasoning as I can on material that I feel is directly supplied by the movie, but I'm also bringing a lot of my own sort of opinions and bias to bear here. On this channel, one thing we believe in is called the death of the author, meaning that even if the creator of a work doesn't intend certain connections, that doesn't mean those connections don't exist, especially if one can make a compelling argument about their existence. As I've said throughout, Scream is a difficult film to categorize, but there's a popular mislabeling of the film as a parody that I want to address first. Scream is most certainly not a parody. Parodies are typified by using the tropes of their parodied subject in absurd ways and heightened manners. The purpose of a parody is very much to make fun of what is being parodied. For a pretty perfect example of what a parody is, look to Scream's sister comedy, Scary Movie.
Hello?
Wanna have a little fun?
Who's this?
Do you like scary movies?
You thought the terror was over. If you believed the nightmare was finished,
Ow!
you were right.
Scary Movie comes from the same germ of an idea as Scream. Look at all these silly things that happen in horror films, and it makes a film-length joke out of it. Its goal is to make you laugh, to imitate and exaggerate the elements of the genre for comic effect. But that's not what Scream does. Scream wraps its acknowledgement of its own genre tropes into a story that is entirely compelling in its own right. It takes that idea germ that people do these silly things in horror movies and practically makes it the killer's raison d'etre. There are, of course, moments of dark humor, stinging wit, and even outright comedy.
Hello?
But the film never wants you to laugh at the idea of the film. These moments are always played as genuine reactions to horrific events happening around the characters.
Fucking hit me with a phone, dick!
Not takedowns of moments themselves. And Scream doesn't want to take down horror movies. Scream loves horror movies. If it didn't, it never would have landed one of horror's great directors. What Scream wants to do is throw down the gauntlet, to tell its own beloved genre that the audience has grown wise to our tricks, and that because of that, those tricks have grown stale. So, if not a parody that makes fun of horror movies, what is Scream? A satire? Largely, yes, but that's also not all it is. Satire, strictly defined, critiques, if not outright mocks, the tropes and conventions that it uses. Most typically, the satire is making a kind of social critique, i.e. the points that it's trying to make are about the ideas within its own subject matter, not about its presentation of that subject matter. Once something begins to challenge or dissect conventional ideas of narrative and structure, then it enters the even headier category of deconstruction. Scream is, also fairly explicitly, a deconstruction. It pulls apart the component elements of a standard horror film to closely examine them. It has characters who are aware of horror's own tropes, which challenges audiences' expectations for how those characters will then behave. Pretty much any time Scream calls out classic horror tropes, it has its peanut-eyed deconstructionist mask on. Ultimately, as a synthesis of both satire and deconstruction, Scream asks, how can we rise above what horror films have become? And cheekily, it doesn't really have to answer. That's another small beauty of the self-aware deconstructionist manner it adopts. It kind of can't. Scream wraps its commentary into a story that uses that commentary to tell a compelling story. It's kind of like a Mobius strip of screenwriting. It's genius as a concept, but it's fully self-contained. It doesn't have a lesson that can be generalized. Make every horror film self-aware is not what the film industry should take from this movie, though the industry is notoriously bad at taking the right lessons of success from anything. Barbie! And to be clear, this isn't a criticism of anything Scream is doing. It's the nature of the beast, and Scream tames this beast about as well as any work could hope to. But Scream isn't just about its own relation to horror. It's also, and I'm the one about to get meta now, about the death of the author. Summed up plainly, the death of the author is basically just the idea that the message an author intends to send is not necessarily the message that his audience will receive. And Scream embodies this with a distinctly feminist spin. Its villains, Billy and Stu, have not just seen too many horror movies, they've taken the wrong things from them. To put it in screenwriter Williamson's words, movies don't create psychos, movies make psychos more creative. Those words, that concept, was to him the thematic core of the film. It wasn't watching When a Stranger Calls that gave Billy the idea to become a psychopath who does his killings that start with a phone call, but it did, perhaps, give him some new ideas. Now, let's take this idea and do what Scream likes to do, which is to apply it to horror movies in general. What messages are the audiences receiving from these films, even if these aren't the messages the filmmakers intend? Horror is a genre prone to violence, by definition, and that violence is very often towards women. Film itself has long been known for its male gaze. Men's gated monopoly on roles behind the camera has led to the common experience of moviegoing involving viewing women more as beautiful objects than individualized beings. Horror movies, though, have often played both sides. The genre itself is known for its final girl trope, where one woman, typically tomboyish with a male-leaning name, Sid, survives to the end, dukes it out with the almost exclusively male antagonist, and embodies many typical male traits, violence, aggression, in order to attain that victory. But the question remains, is this a feminist portrayal? Or is this just a slightly more synthetic object of the male gaze? This is a tricky question, and it's one that Carol J. Clover attempts to answer in her seminal work, Men, Women, and Chainsaws: Gender in the Modern Horror Film, a book that was pivotal for me in my work on this video essay, as well as in gaining a greater understanding of horror films in general. If you want a very enlightening, very academic book, I do recommend it. There's literally never been a waiting list for it on my library app, and I have checked many times. Frankly, to the final girl question, I don't have a good answer. But as it ties to this section's central question of whether it's a feminist portrayal or not, I certainly think it's intended to be. Horror filmmakers never, I hope, intend to make films that promote violence and misogyny. The final girl's agency and power being an example of that. But that is still the message that so many receive upon viewing, especially if that portrayal is lazy. But for Scream, the answer to that problem is not to dodge the question and avoid the challenge, it's to step up to it. Firstly, the proof is in the pudding. Scream was at the vanguard of a horror revolution that really invited female viewers into the theater, and audiences responded in kind. Fast forward to today, where you have true crime, a genre whose execution stands on the shoulder of horror films, that is absolutely dominated by a female audience. Horror was never meant to be a man's genre, and horror, which often necessitated low budgets to even exist, came with this pseudo-punk mentality, them versus the larger industry, which also tends to lean inclusive in an anti-establishment sort of way. But with Scream and its wide success, this movement became mainstream in a new way. Another feminist element of Scream is the treatment of sex. Especially after the original Friday the 13th, horror films often functioned as morality plays, with those who committed sins of any kind more or less punching their ticket to a gruesome death. And sex, lending itself most lecherously to the medium of film, was the ticket most often punched. Scream gets explicit on this front, with Billy embodying mondo oogie grossness to try to sleep with Sidney from the very first moment that we see him.
I was home watching television. The Exorcist was on. It got me thinking of you.
It did?
Yeah. It was edited for TV, you know, all the good stuff was cut out, and it got me thinking of us.
Little do we know, Billy's mind already has this potential deflowering built into his plan as a real-life horror movie killer. Horror movies have rules, and he has to follow those rules, meaning Sidney isn't really allowed to die until she loses her virginity. Ideally, in his mind, to him, and quickly. Scream doubles down on this idea later, once Randy drops his incredible 3 rules of horror movies.
Don't you know the rules?
And which one is given primacy? Don't have sex.
Big no-no!
But when Billy's plan finally works, and Sidney drops her suspicions, the two do finally get together, and Ghostface immediately drops in to get this now available kill.
Oh my god.
Sidney.
Billy, watch out!
But unlike in every other movie where Sid would meet her demise, she survives here, and again, until she puts that final bullet through Billy's fetid brain. Amidst many other cunning deconstructionist moves, Sidney's post-coital survival may be Scream's greatest genre conversion. Themes: 10 out of 10 very phallic weapons.
You want to play psycho killer? Can I be the helpless victim? Okay, let's see. No, please don't kill me, Mr. Ghostface. I want to be in the sequel.
No accounting of the working parts of Scream would be complete without some time spent analyzing the effectiveness of its horror and the effectiveness of its humor. Despite Scream's difficulty in fitting in a particular category, there are at least two undeniable things about it. It's got the ha-has and the oh-nos, so in this section, we're going to put the horror and the humor under a microscope, looking at not only how they work separately, but together. My first exposure to the horrors of Scream was seeing the Ghostface mask at a tender age, and I was indeed horrified. Something about that twisted, pale face just creeped me out to my core, and I avoided everything I could about the movie until well into my teenage years. Already, high marks for horror. When I first saw it, I was incredibly impressed, read scared shitless, by how effective its scares were. From the opening scene we already discussed to death, to Sidney's first surprising encounter with Ghostface in her school bathroom, combat boots slinking predatorially down into frame, to Himbery's shocking demise, and beyond. Though Tatum's death stands out for how unrealistic it is, it also remains one of the most effective scenes in the film, and left its most lasting mark on my young self. Perhaps the fact that, of all locales, a spooky garage felt the most relatable, but hard to say. In the garage, we all had those sensors that would stop the door from crushing you, but I think as a youth that the garage door in general was like that AC unit in the Brave Little Toaster, a large, terrifying piece of metal that felt like it really had the potential to fuck you up.
It's my function!
Now, I'm using horror as a catch-all term for the entirety of Scream's fear-inducing effectiveness. A masterful pattern of tension and release, something I think is key to just about any creative endeavor, in almost every kill sequence, and Wes Craven pushes it all with incredible skill. I've covered some of the more effective horror moments here already, particularly when commenting on Craven's excellent direction, but a few things also really stand out to me. That 30-second tape delay on the hidden camera Gale places inside the party at Stu's house is incredible. It's set up and paid off excellently, ending in the whip-fast kill of Gale's poor cameraman. Ghostface's slick blood knife wipe is an incredibly menacing move that makes third act Ghostface really feel like the biggest threat yet. That brief flash of Tatum's mangled corpse when Sid comes upon it at the end of the third act, and that truly stomach-dropping moment when Billy snaps out of his fake bloodied delusion and reveals himself as the real killer with the quote from Psycho. We all go a little mad sometimes. And once again, I can't leave here without lingering on the design of Ghostface. I touched on it moments ago as well as earlier in the essay, but I just adore this look. The mask looks like the hollow, uncaring incarnation of evil. To my mind, it's the most effective horror mask since Michael Myers, and in the wide world, maybe even more iconic. The simplicity of the entire outfit, all black save for the pained contours of white that outline the mask's features, really makes it feel less like an outfit for a human and more like an avatar of evil, some kind of angered spirit who exists simply to stab, slice, and kill. Combined with the physicality Ghostface is given, sprinting, lunging, almost teleporting between locations when off-screen, and you have a recipe for horror success. The horror, 9 out of 10 spooky ghosts. A big part of my day job at All Things Comedy is working with writers, comedians, and other pieces of talent to nail moments of humor. One sort of soundbite that I often come back to is that, to me, the best type of comedy is real people reacting in genuine ways to heightened situations. I've always loved the humor in Scream, in no small part because it's constantly executing that very formula. The events of the actual film are entirely improbable, the sort of things that quite literally only happen in horror films. And seeing characters behave like real people, not in the nonsensical manner of previous horror characters, almost always brings delight. Even if it's not out-and-out humor when Sidney bashes at Ghostface, knocking him into the ground in slapstick style, it's still most certainly fun. And fun courses throughout the film in surprising ways. There's plenty of comedy that doesn't necessarily bring with it that sense of delight, but one of the best parts of Scream is the sheer delight of it all. The teenage characters bring a cavalier aloofness to the seriousness of these moments that undercuts what would otherwise be genuine tragedy. And it's believable, because that's what teens do. They quip, they snark, they don't take things seriously. And that's why we're following high schoolers in this movie. It's not a bunch of 40-year-olds getting shanked by a disgruntled no-name. The dialogue and the humor are, of course, ineluctably intertwined, and even my latest rewatch had me laughing out loud at times. Gale, can you tell me anything? Tatum, yeah, you're a pain in the ass. Dewey grabbing the phone to cautiously say hello after the second Ghostface call is a very funny tag to the scene.
Hello.
Himbry scaring himself when he sees the Ghostface mask that he's holding in his own mirror. Jamie Kennedy freaking out about how there's always a formula to these things in the video store when behind him a woman is reacting in like active disgust.
There's always some stupid bullshit reason to kill your girlfriend. That's the beauty of it all. Simplicity. Besides, if it gets too complicated, you lose your target audience.
Dewey being smitten that Gale is with him, going into the party and taking someone's beer, but being like, nah, I'm kidding, just don't drive. Tatum's dialogue with Ghostface before she gets killed, it has that incredible, tragic, ironic, think I'm joking, but I'm actually about to get murdered thing going on.
Oh, you want to play psycho killer? Can I be the helpless victim? Okay, let's see. No, please don't kill me, Mr. Ghostface. I want to be in the sequel.
Gale tossing her dead cameraman off her van's roof with a "get off my fucking roof."
Get off my fucking with you!
Always gets a laugh. And Stu genuinely saying hello on the phone when he's delirious from blood loss at the end. A lot of great phone-centric moments in this one.
Hello?
Honestly, using third act Stu in this one is a little unfair, as literally every moment that he's on screen tickles my funny bone in some way or another. Even though he's taken this turn for the insane, Lillard as an actor is just so clearly fucking going for it and having fun with every line and mannerism, and it's a joy to watch. I think it's a big part of why this movie has stood the test of time, is Stu's behavior in that final act. And despite all these incredible comedic moments throughout, one of Scream's greatest comic virtues is one that is rarely discussed in pretty much any form. It knows when not to be funny. As I'll hit before we're out of here, horror comedy is one of the hardest tonal marks to hit. And part of the difficulty comes in finding ways to get laughs without stepping on your scares. Scream does this perfectly, letting its laughs disappear as the third act closes. Remember, this is a movie about the consequences of being in a horror movie, and by turning down the humor in the final moments, letting the drama and the trauma breathe, it's as great a merit towards its comic sensibility as some of its biggest laughs. The humor? 8 out of 10 Seinfelds. Lastly, and as promised, I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to shine a spotlight on one of Scream's incredible balancing acts. It's horror comedy. Horror comedy is, in my humble and correct opinion, the hardest genre to execute. And in asking the question, why do we like Scream, some time must be spent on how deftly it really treads this tonal knife's edge. First, it's important to note what horror and comedy have in common. A phrase I've said, perhaps annoyingly, in my real life is that horror and comedy are next-door neighbors, and they borrow each other's sugar. They're two seemingly separate philosophies that operate off of the same principle: surprise.
Surprise, motherfucker!
And that surprise, unsurprisingly, exists within the mechanism of tension and release we discussed earlier. The surprise is actually the moment that tension we've built up is released, the thing that causes that phase shift into release and brings with it catharsis. Here's an example for each. If a joke has an obvious punchline, there's no tension, and there's no joy from the release, from the delivery. But if you can't see where a joke is going, but know it must be headed somewhere, the tension starts to form. And it's that unpredictability of when that release will come, when we will be surprised, that keeps us invested, excited, and when the punchline finally does come,
surprise, motherfucker,
laughing. So it is with horror. Even knowing a jump scare, the laziest of all frights, is coming is enough to make one tense. But it's the surprise of the exact moment that scare occurs that leads to that jolt of chemical release that floods our synapses with pleasure. Yes, this is how I actually think about this stuff, and this is the sort of hard-hitting concept dirt bullshit you can expect from this channel as you continue to watch. Next, an exercise. How many horror comedies can you actually think of, just off the top of your head? I'll wait. For you, I exist on a multimedia player. Pause me, take your time. Even with a notably muddy definition, there's some obvious entries to the genre. Some of my favorites from the past 2-ish decades: Shaun of the Dead,
Take car, go to Mum's, kill Phil, grab Liz, go to the Winchester, have a nice cold pint, and wait for all this to blow over.
Tucker vs. Evil,
You okay?
and Hot Fuzz.
When's your birthday?
22nd of February.
What year?
Every year. Get out.
To me, all three of these films are incredible, hilarious, sharp, and timeless. Part of why they work as well as they do is that they're essentially two films in one. Each film works as both a comedy and a horror in its own right, and that is, fundamentally, the task of the horror comedy. And if you haven't tried writing a screenplay yourself, let me tell you, it's some hard shit. In my dev role, I often refer to it as an impossible task that we try to fuck up as little as we can. Quality scripts are rare, shockingly so, given the volume of people, even talented people, trying to write good ones. So to write one good movie is a rapturous achievement. To do a horror comedy, to essentially cram 2 films into one, is damn near godlike. But to bring in the blood-sucking capitalist angle, how are these godlike achievements rewarded? Shaun of the Dead earned $30 million at the box office off of a $6.1 million budget. Tucker and Dale vs. Evil in the US grossed only $223,000. Internationally, it fared better at around $5 million, which ends up covering its budget of $5 million. But if you're someone who's looking to make more horror comedies, those sorts of economics don't bode well. And then Hot Fuzz lastly has the most success of the ones we're looking at here, which made $80 million off of a budget of between 12 and 60 million, depending on who you ask. So as much as it pains me to admit it, and given my day job, admitting it is something that I have to do constantly, films are only ever made if someone with money sees an opportunity to make more money.
Money, please.
And these films, even the greatest ones, just do not make money.
Money, please. Money, please.
Shaun and Fuzz, 2 Edgar Wright joints, at least turn a profit. But these days, the middle class of films has been gutted in a very Casey Becker-esque way, resulting in a glut of either massive budget tentpole releases or tiny indies with hope of outsized upside. Which is to say that horror comedies, as a business model, are deader than a Woodsboro principle. That being the case, one could well argue that Scream's box office success, turning a $14 million budget into a $173 million box office take, is an outlier among outliers. Heck, that's why we're here. And one of Hollywood's rules, as you may have heard, is that no one knows anything. And even more ironclad than that is that every rule in the book can be broken if the film is good enough. It's kind of like the Pirates Code that way.
The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
And Scream, as the evidence is borne out, was a good enough film to break all those rules. Kevin Williamson's incredible screenplay, combined with Wes Craven's horror-honed direction and a cast of strong performances, elevated this piece beyond expectations. It's not that Scream only succeeded because of its effective blending of horror and comedy, but it never could have succeeded without it. Horror comedy, 9 out of 10 Edgar Wrights.
Listen, it was Jason. I saw that movie 20 goddamn times.
Then you should know Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, was the original killer. Jason didn't show up until the sequel.
Is Scream rewatchable? Why do we even think we're here? Scream is, at least in my life, one of the most rewatchable films ever. The first viewing, you're on the edge of your seat, reeled in by the mystery of who is behind the Ghostface mask, and peeking through your fingers at the next gleefully gruesome kill. The second time through, you're watching to see how much you can catch Billy and Stu in the act, trying to puzzle out which one was in the costume for any given attack, watching as they play a pretty masterful 2-man game on their way to the finale. Once you have the most immediately intention-grabbing elements out of the way and sort of firmly in hand, future watches let you marinate more in the world. Get a better sense of the many flavors and spices that Williamson and Craven and the entire production team put into this incredible film. My favorite, as I've already pulled once or twice before here, is this woman in the background, fully out of focus, having a genuine, hilarious reaction to Randy talking about how one always has a bullshit reason to kill their girlfriend. For rewatchability, this one's easy. 10 out of 10 background sneers.
Several more local teens are dead, bringing to an end the harrowing mystery of the mass killings that has terrified this peaceful community, like the plot of some scary movie.
After an exhaustive look at just about everything both in and around the film, why do we like Scream? Because it's an impeccably written, well-cast and well-acted, sharply directed film that manages to balance impossibly on the knife's edge of humor and horror, a satire with legitimate scares, a deconstruction of tired tropes that offers its own refreshment of them, and a slasher with an iconic killer whose terrifying look slingshot both Ghostface and Scream into the pantheon of horror. Also because they spent 13 minutes killing Drew Barrymore, and these days all they want to do is eat the fucking rich.